No one in the church let out a breath when Samuel Briggs spoke. His voice was low, steady, without the slightest tremor, like a man reading out a sentence. "You're not what I expected. I can't take a black woman for my wife." The words didn't just halt every breath. They split the air in two, tearing through what little fragility already hung in that room. The groan of wooden pews, a cough stifled halfway, eyes darting down to the floor, all of it rolled into a silence so thick it felt like it could choke. And then, under the gaze of the whole town, Samuel stepped back, not forward, but turned toward the door. No apology, no glance over his shoulder. He left Eleanor standing in the aisle, fingers locked tight around a small bouquet of wildflowers, while the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether she would crumble or stand. The last toll of the bell had barely faded when the church doors swung open, as if pushed by the same wind sweeping down Main Street. Eleanor May Dalton stepped inside, her blue cotton dress, the one she had sewn herself in the glow of many late nights by lamplight, swaying with each measured step. The folds at the hem still held the chill of morning, and the wildflowers in her hands glistened with fragile beads of dew, trembling as she passed through the colored shafts of light spilling from the stained glass windows onto the wooden aisle. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of old pine and warm beeswax. The pews, lined up in perfect order, shone smooth where generations of hands had rested in search of quiet strength. Sunlight poured through the tall panes, laying deep crimson and cool blue across the floorboards, so that each of her steps seemed to tread upon carpets woven of light. Yet beneath that stillness was a tautness, thin as a fiddle string wound too tight. Eleanor felt it in the way heads turned toward her, not quite curious, not quite kind, as though they were reading a page never before opened in this place. At the far end of the aisle stood Samuel Briggs beside the minister, his dark waistcoat snug over a frame accustomed to standing, as straight and unyielding as fence posts in the wind. His face was freshly shaven, his skin weathered by long days in the fields. When their eyes met, there was no welcoming smile, no shared spark of understanding. Only a glance, brief as a blade's flash, and then emptiness. He stepped back half a pace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to still the whispers in the front rows and draw a breathless pause from those behind. Eleanor's stride faltered, and the flowers in her hands seemed suddenly heavier. Samuel spoke. His voice was low and flat, the kind that allowed no doubt it would be heard. "You're not what I expected." His gaze traveled over her, head to toe, then lingered long enough for the cold to settle deep into the quiet. "I thought I'd meet a white widow, tidy, easy to manage, not a black woman with her hair wrapped and eyes that look like they can read a man's mind." The words, though soft in volume, carried to every corner, threading themselves into the gaps between the roof beams and sinking into the faded fabric of the curtains. A pew creaked as someone shifted. A cough, stifled in the far left corner, died halfway out. All of it rolled together into a silence thick enough to press against the skin. A woman halfway down the middle row clicked her tongue, so faint only those nearest could hear. A tall, lean man at the back looked away quickly, unwilling to meet Eleanor's eyes. The colored light still fell across her dress, but the blue was colder now, like the face of a deep lake on a windless day. She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around the stems until she heard the faint crack of a stalk. The sound sharp against her palm, the scent of wildflowers rose stronger, mingling with the beeswax and the starch of her own dress. an uneasy mix she could barely swallow past her throat. Samuel adjusted the buttons on his vest, his eyes already turning toward the door, as though he'd chosen his escape. The faint rasp of leather soles against the boards echoed louder than it should have in the hush. The minister kept his gaze lowered to the open Bible before him, though his eyes had long left the page. In the front pew, an elderly couple exchanged the smallest of nods, the kind that belonged to people who either saw this coming or refused to be surprised. At the very back, a child swung his legs, shoelaces whispering against the floor in a steady tick, like a clock marking the seconds until something broke. Eleanor stood still, her heartbeat so loud in her ears it seemed the only sound left. Outside, the wind moved through the row of cedars, their rustling a distant reminder the world was still turning. She looked down at her flowers, some petals already curled from the sun's touch through the glass, the dewdrops no longer round and full as they had been at dawn. It was too much change in too little time, as if all those hours spent stitching her dress had been for nothing more than this moment. Then Samuel turned. No apology, no parting glance, only the sure stride of a man heading for the open door, passing faces that turned with him like weather vanes catching a sudden gust. The white glare of daylight swallowed him whole before the door closed again. Eleanor remained where she was. The bells were silent now, replaced by the muted thud of feet leaving the pews. There were quick glances, averted eyes, carefully neutral faces pretending nothing had happened. The occasion they had come for was gone, leaving only the bare frame of 4 wooden walls. She lowered her head, not from shame but as if to shield herself from the weight of every look cast her way. One petal slipped from the bouquet, spinning slowly before coming to rest against the dark scratch in the floorboards, a small and stubborn trace of presence. The last to leave was the blacksmith. He laid a hand on the back of the pew for balance, straightened, and looked at her briefly. Not with pity, but with something harder to name, like the unease of seeing a fine crack appear in a wall you'd thought unshakable. When the door shut behind him, the space was left to the wind slipping through the cracks and the fading light retreating from the stained glass. In that quiet, Eleanor's hands slackened. The flowers drooped, stems bent. Their scent was no longer promise but the aftertaste of a morning already gone, carrying with it something she had not yet found the words for. And she stood there still, in the aisle, as dust drifted slowly down from the rafters, settling into the layers left by all the other stories this town would tell, and then forget just the same. The bell's toll spread outward like ripples across a still pond. From the narrow lanes where weeds crowded against broken fences to the unlit saloon on the corner, every ordinary sound paused for the briefest beat. The man tightening a saddle strap stilled his hands and looked up. The grocer's wife pushed back her calico curtain to peer out. A small child, cradling a yellow cat on the porch, tilted his head as if to listen. Along Main Street, the red dust, stirred by boots and wagon wheels, floated in the morning light before drifting slowly back down. Footsteps began to gather, unhurried but certain, all moving toward the same point. Men in dark coats brushed down their sleeves, their leather shoes carrying a faint sheen where mud had been knocked away. Women wrapped in shawls whose colors had long since faded still carried the faint lavender scent of dried blossoms kept in cedar chests. The church emerged more fully as they drew near. Its pitched roof, clad in weathered pine shingles, bore darker seams where years of resin had seeped through. The heavy doors stood ajar, the shadow inside cool and still as the bottom of a well. Out on the porch, a cluster of children huddled close, their whispers breaking into giggles, only to vanish under a single pointed glance from a watching mother. In the yard, the young cedars swayed gently in the breeze. Sunlight spilled through the colored panes, casting bright patches across the front steps and catching in the fine motes of dust drifting in the air. A few people had already taken their seats inside, backs straight on the pews, hands folded neatly in their laps. Expectation threaded itself into small movements, the way someone adjusted the bow on her hat, or glanced toward the doorway whenever the echo of hoofbeats came near. It was as if the whole town had gathered into an unseen arc around the church, holding its breath for the moment about to unfold. The bell kept ringing, and with each peal the familiar calm shifted, making way for a day that long after it ended would still be spoken of in Bitter Creek. Eleanor's footsteps made little sound on the wooden boards, yet each one landed in her chest like a slow, heavy knock. Her skirt brushed through the red dust, leaving a faint trail leading away from the heart of town. On the stoop of the general store, an old woman winding a spool of thread watched until Eleanor's figure was swallowed by the glare beyond. The gingham curtain of a small cafe stirred, just enough for a curious glance to slip through, before it fell shut again, as though her presence was something both unwelcome and impossible to look away from. A petal from the bouquet she had carried in the church still clung to her hem. Pale yellow, once picked fresh from the grass near the creek, now bent at the stem, dust dulled, dropping quietly with each step. The wind teased the edge of her headscarf, lifting it enough to free a few dark strands that curled around the collar of her dress. She neither hurried nor stopped, only moved forward, each measured pace widening the distance between herself and the church, as if every yard of ground were a thread being cut from an old, worn cloth. Beyond Main Street, the way turned into a packed strip of dirt and scattered stone, fenced on both sides by weathered rails and fields of autumn-bleached grass. In the distance, a few cattle stood beneath the shade of old cedars, heads bent to graze, unmoved by the lone figure passing by. Behind her, the church bell was silent now, replaced by the far-off rattle of a wagon headed somewhere else. She crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a nearly dry creek. Below, the water no longer ran, only shallow pools catching the pale silver of a midday sky. Eleanor paused halfway, resting her hand against the rough rail, feeling the deep cracks worn by rain and wind. There was something in that touch, a reminder of what had once been smooth, new, and had since hardened, that made her feel both apart from and akin to the bridge. The road toward the edge of town was quieter still, only the wind's long pull through the tall grass, and the soft clink of a metal gate chain tapping against its post when the breeze shifted. With every step, she shed another layer. Things worn for others, shaped by others, now without purpose. At the crossroads, she didn't look back. To the left lay the large ranches, where the ring of hammers and the scent of tanned leather never left the air. To the right, the dirt road curved along the hillside, vanishing toward the blue-shadowed ridges far away. She chose the second path, not because it promised a destination, but because it led away from every set of eyes that had fixed her in place that morning. The hilltop wind was stronger, tugging pins loose from her coiled hair. Dark strands came free, sweeping across her neck and cheek. She didn't bother to smooth them, letting them fly as they wished, a quiet declaration that no one else would decide how she should appear. Above, clouds stretched into a long gray band, muting the sun and deepening the gold brown of the grass. She walked until the town was nothing more than a smudge behind her, blurred into the meeting of earth and sky. The whispers were long gone, yet their trace clung faint as the smoke from an old fire. Here, where the road split into a narrow trail climbing toward the pines and another slipping down into the valley, she stopped. Her breath came slow, steady, her gaze opening to the wide reach ahead. No 40 pairs of eyes, no creaking pews, only herself, the slopes, and a silence that asked for nothing to fill it. At her feet, the last petal from her bouquet loosened and fell, spinning once in the wind before coming to rest among the dust and dry grass. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, then walked on, leaving fresh footprints on a road where no one waited, but no one stood in her way. Eleanor stood where the land opened into a sea of sunburnt grass. No fences, no clear path, only the horizon pressing against a copper-washed sky. The late-day light poured over her like dark honey, warm and heavy, catching in her hair until it shone with a strange red-gold glint. She lifted her hands to untie the ribbon fastening her bonnet beneath her chin. The soft fabric slid over calloused fingers, dropping lightly into her other palm. Once freed, the evening wind swept in, swift, unhesitating, as though it had been waiting for this chance. Her dark hair, bound since morning, burst loose, tangling in the dry gusts, brushing against her cheeks and neck. Some strands caught on her buttons, some twisted together, but she made no move to smooth them. Eleanor closed her eyes. The stillness here was not the stillness of town, not the thick quiet of words unsaid, but an open emptiness where every sound was carried away by the wind. Here what she spoke would not snag on 4 stairs, nor rebound from wooden church walls. "I'm ugly." Her voice slipped out low, even, like a sentence etched long ago into the marrow. It was not a fresh cut, but the faded shape of an old scar. The wind sliced the words apart, scattering them over the grass until they disappeared at the horizon. No one heard. No one argued. No one soothed. And because of that, for the first time the words didn't weigh on her like a stone tied to her throat. She opened her eyes. Before her, the hills rolled toward the deep blue mountains. Far off, a small plume of dust drifted, maybe wild horses, or maybe the wind teasing the dry earth. The angled light deepened everything, the cracks in the ground, the ruts left by long-gone wagon wheels, the shadows of low brush stretching like hands searching for a hold. She stepped down the slope, her boots pressing into loose soil. Each step made a dry, muted sound, swallowed almost instantly. There was no one behind her to hear it, but she kept her pace steady, as though the rhythm itself was the only thread holding her to the moment. A hawk cut across the sky, its shadow gliding quick over the grass. Eleanor followed it until it vanished behind a low rise. The wind brought with it a far-off scent, pine resin and smoke, tangled with the heat-baked smell of earth. Somewhere ahead, perhaps miles away, there was fire. Crossing an open stretch with nothing to hide behind, she felt more defined than she ever had. No white wedding dress. No seams stitched from someone else's expectations. Only the cotton she had sewn herself. A few mud stains at the hem, hair wild in the wind, and a body marked by seasons and hours no clock had counted. She plucked a dry stalk of grass, rolling it between her fingers. Brittle, rigid, but still able to bend if handled with patience. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, not for anyone to see, only to feel on her own face. Hoofbeats rose from a distance. She lifted her head, eyes narrowing. Through the haze, a dark shape swelled on the horizon. A man on horseback, upright in the saddle, his movement steady. Not hurried, but not idle. The horse was black, its long mane streaming back, cutting a clean line through the amber of the setting sun. Eleanor stood still, the stalk in her hand snapping in two. The rider drew closer, his hat brim pulled low, shadowing half his face. He did not greet her or speak, only eased his reins so the horse slowed as they passed. Their eyes met for a moment. No scrutiny, no pity, no curiosity, only acknowledgement. There was another person here, at this hour. Then he rode on, the beat of hooves fading into the wind, as if carrying her words with them. Eleanor watched him go but didn't turn back. She walked forward, her hair still streaming behind her, each step pushing the fragments of the morning further away. "I'm ugly," had been said, had been taken and left in the distance. The road ahead was long, and there would be other words to speak to the wind. But for now, she let silence walk beside her, a companion who asked nothing but to remain. Water pooled in a shallow hollow, catching the late sun and mirroring a patch of deep blue sky streaked with thin clouds like smoke trails. Eleanor bent low, cupping her hands to lift a drink. The cold slid through her roughened fingers, strange and startling after a day beneath the dry heat. But before she could bring it to her lips, shadow swallowed the surface. She started and looked up. A tall figure stood across the waterhole, stepping from behind the cottonwood. His shadow stretched long across the ground, cutting away the harsh afternoon glare. He stood as if rooted there, silent, unmoving, not breaking the air, as though he had been part of the land long before she arrived. Tohanu. His name rose in her mind before she recognized the signs: the long black hair tied with deerskin, the goatskin coat edged with beads of blue and white, the sharp lines of cheekbone, the quiet, full gaze like a lake before a storm. Eleanor stepped back half a pace, not from fear, but from the feeling of being read. He did not stare, yet his eyes rested on her long enough to thicken the air between them. The desert wind shifted, carrying pine resin and wood smoke. The cottonwood's shadow rippled. A few thin yellow leaves fell onto the water, sending out small rings that vanished as quickly as they formed. Tohanu moved closer, each step slow and certain, his soft leather shoes making no sound. At the edge, he knelt and drank from his broad hands, strong yet deliberate, like a practiced rite. Eleanor stayed still. She saw droplets cling to the sparse whiskers on his jaw, saw the roll of solid shoulders beneath the hide. Everything about him gave off a steadiness she had never known in the men of her own life. Without looking up, Tohanu pressed his wet palm to the ground, as if leaving a mark. Then he spoke, his voice low and rasped, his English touched by the cadence of his people. "This water is deeper than it looks." Eleanor couldn't tell if he meant the pool or herself. They stood side by side without another word, the air holding only the quiet drip of water, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, and the beat of her heart folded into it all. Then, sharp and dry, a gunshot cracked from far off, echoing from the road she had walked earlier. Birds burst from the branches in a scatter of wings. Eleanor turned, startled, but Tohanu was already on his feet. His eyes darkened to near black. He glanced toward the sound, then back at her. And in that glance she saw more than caution. She saw the moment he claimed responsibility for her safety, though they had only just met. He motioned her back, striding to a bay horse tethered in the brush. The animal's cropped mane tossed as it caught his urgency. With a swift hand, he loosed the rope and said, short and low, "Mount." Eleanor hesitated. Before she could ask why, another shot rang out, closer. This time she didn't need urging. Tohanu's hand closed around her arm, firm and warm, anchoring her, like nothing else had all day. She swung up behind him, her arms wrapping around the hard span of his waist. As soon as she held on, Tohanu drove the horse forward. The wind lashed her face, the scents of sweat, leather, and desert air tangled together. Hooves struck the ground in a pounding drumbeat. The gunfire faded behind them as they cut deeper into open country. Tohanu rode with an easy mastery, dodging sharp stones, skimming past low cactus, crossing bare stretches as if he knew every grain of sand. They stopped only when a wall of red rock rose to block the wind. Eleanor realized her hands were still knotted in his coat. She let go a little awkwardly, but he said nothing, only dismounted, tied the horse to a cleft, and turned back to her with a look that asked if she was whole, yet assured her she was safe. No explanations, no questions. Just his presence, and the sense that whatever danger prowled out there had been held at bay, at least for now. Eleanor understood something then. The desert wind could carry away the words she had no use for, but sometimes, like now, it brought someone she hadn't expected. Someone who might change what came next. Tohanu sat on a flat rock, his back to the mottled red cliff that looked scorched by the sun. Late light slipped through cracks in the stone, staining his hair with a deep bronze glow. He lifted one hand, a small motion calling Eleanor forward. No explanation, yet something in his eyes drew her as if by an unseen cord. She stopped a few steps from him, her hands still clasped tight, as if unsure where to put them. She was used to questions, to scrutinizing looks, to whispered judgment. But here, with only wind and water between them, the silence pressed in so heavily she didn't know whether to stay or turn away. Then Tohanu held out his hand, not to pull her closer, but to borrow something. Eleanor tilted her head, and he nodded toward her wind-snared hair. She stepped nearer, lowering herself in front of him. Without a word, he slipped a thin strip of leather from his wrist. His fingers began untangling the knots, slow, careful, no haste, no pain. Eleanor closed her eyes. She realized this was the first time in her life someone had touched her hair without an ulterior motive, without judgment or pity. Each movement seemed to say something unspoken, that she was still whole, still worth the care, even after being cast aside in front of the town. He divided her hair into 3 even sections, his calloused hands steady but never rough. The scent of leather mingled with the faint resin of pine drifting in the wind, enclosing them in a small cocoon apart from the rest of the world. When the braid was finished, Tohanu tied the end. No excess, no slack. He let it fall against her back like a new mark. No compliment, no reassurance. But Eleanor felt as though she had been tended to, not repaired. She touched the knot lightly, ready to speak, when another sound cut in. Hoofbeats, distant at first, then swelling, the jingle of tack, the scrape of wagon wheels grinding over dry earth. Tohanu turned toward the noise, his eyes shifting shade like river stones under cloud. He motioned Eleanor into the cliff's shadow. She hesitated only a moment before pressing herself against the cool rock. 4 riders crested the low rise. Faded coats, wide brims pulled low, revolvers hanging loose at their hips. They spread in a practiced arc, the kind meant to trap. The leader jerked his chin, voice rough with dust. "Seen a blonde girl pass through here?" Tohanu stood square, his shoulder angling to block their view of Eleanor. He didn't answer. The man smirked, went on. "She ran from the church. Someone's paying to bring her back." Eleanor's chest tightened at the word paying. The town would not stop until it dragged her back, like a misplaced parcel. The air thickened. Tohanu took one step forward, the light catching half his face. His voice was low, deliberate. "No one here but me." The leader studied him for a long moment, then tilted his head. Another rider let out a short, ugly laugh, but it died when Tohanu's hand rested on the bow, at his horse's flank. He didn't draw, only set his palm there. Still, the tension in the air made the front horses shift uneasily, backing a step. At last, the leader spat into the dust. "If you see her, tell her Samuel Briggs wants a word." They wheeled their horses, circling away. The hoofbeats faded into the wind. Tohanu stood unmoving until they were swallowed by the horizon. Then he turned to Eleanor, his gaze counting her over as if to be sure she was all in one piece. She stepped from the shadows, feeling the fresh braid as though it anchored her to this exact moment. She knew that if she kept going with Tohanu, there would be harsher winds ahead, but for the first time, she didn't want to turn back toward the road she'd left. The desert wind moved through, carrying away the words she had left on the edge of town. "I'm ugly." Here in this quiet, they were no heavier than a petal, and had no strength left to hold her down. They traveled together across the semi-desert, like 2 long shadows cast on the sand, neither hurried nor slow, but with purpose in every step. The summer sun laid its gold over a patchwork of dust and scorched grass. At every pause, Tohanu turned the stop into a survival lesson, showing her the rock hollows that held rainwater, how to tell if hoofprints were fresh or fading, and how to read the horizon's color for the rise of a sandstorm. Eleanor listened and remembered, not because she believed she would need these things forever, but because in each word, in each gesture, she recognized something rare: patience. He didn't teach to prove himself, but to share, as if knowledge were a meal placed between them both. By day, the sun burned so fiercely that even the wind felt dry against the skin. Yet sometimes Tohanu would find a scrap of shade from a mesquite tree or a tall rock face. They would sit there, sip water in measured mouthfuls, and listen to sand shift underfoot. Those silences no longer unsettled Eleanor. Between them, silence had become its own language. At night, the temperature fell as sharply as a blade. Northern winds lashed the skin like fine, stinging cords. Whenever he saw her pull her coat tighter, Tohanu would place his thick hide jacket over her shoulders without a word. The first time he did this, she started to refuse, but he met her eyes and murmured, so quietly, the wind almost stole it away, "I'm not cold." In truth, Eleanor knew he was. She saw how he held his hands closer to the fire than usual, saw the skin at his wrists draw taut in the night air. But he never took the jacket back. She didn't know whether to thank him or keep quiet, whether to hold it as a debt or as part of their journey. In the end, she only drew it closer and lay under a sky thick with stars. On the 3rd day, as they followed a dry riverbed, Tohanu stopped. He bent, fingers brushing deep impressions in the sand. Not animal. Boots, fresh, They're closer, he said, and this time Eleanor didn't need to ask who they were. The sense of being hunted grew sharper. Every echo on the sand, every flicker at the edge of sight tightened her chest. Tohanu's pace did not change. He simply chose paths harder to follow, sloping rock faces, narrow passes, so their tracks would blend with those of mountain goats and wild sheep. That afternoon, a plume of dust rose in the south. Not a storm, hooves. Tohanu pulled her into a narrow crevice, pressing them shoulder to shoulder. He set a finger to his lips, eyes telling her not to breathe too loud. The hoofbeats passed above. From the shadows, she caught the outline of two mounted men sliding by, the sun flashing off the revolvers at their hips. They didn't stop, but Eleanor knew one misstep would have ended the journey here. When the sound was gone, they moved on. Night fell quickly, as if the sun wanted to leave this land earlier than it should. They built a small fire in a hollow, hidden from view. Eleanor noticed her hands shaking as she passed Tohanu a cup of water, not from the cold, but from the strain still coiled inside her ribs. He looked at her, then set his warm, broad hand over hers. Just for a few seconds. But it was enough to quiet the uneven rhythm of her heart, enough to tell her without words, "I'm still here." The next morning, the wind shifted, carrying a different scent. Smoke. Not theirs. Farther off, Tohanu climbed to a ridge, raising a leather-bound scope to his eye. A thin column of smoke trailed up from the north. "Could be them," he said, "or somewhere we ought to avoid." They veered off, deeper into harsher ground. Here the sand was pale, mixed with stone and the sun-bleached bones of animals. The openness meant anyone high enough could see them from miles away. Tohanu quickened his pace, and Eleanor, though tired, didn't ask to stop. By midday, her feet were bleeding inside worn shoes. Tohanu said nothing, simply stooped and lifted her onto his horse. She thought to protest, but when she saw how he rode, one hand on the reins, one arm steady around her waist, she stayed silent. Late in the day, they found a broad rock shelter large enough to serve for the night. Eleanor tended a small fire while Tohanu checked his weapons, pulling each arrow to examine its tip before sliding it back into the quiver. The quiet efficiency of it steadied her and unsettled her all at once. When the flames had burned low, Eleanor lay listening to the wind hissing through the stone cracks. She knew this was no longer only a flight from pursuit. This was the line between being dragged back into a past she no longer wanted and stepping into a life she had never dared imagine. And she knew one thing more. If they slipped even once, Samuel Briggs, or the men he paid, would find them. That morning, the first sunlight spilled over the semi-desert, painting the dry grass in a copper sheen. Tohanu led Eleanor into a narrow valley where the ground dipped into a stretch of grass greener than anything around it. He said it had once been a grazing ground for his people's horses. From a distance, Eleanor saw the shapes of black, brown, and gray horses clustered together, heads bent to feed. But as they drew nearer, Tohanu's expression tightened. He dismounted, motioning for her to stay put, then walked forward slowly, scanning every detail. It didn't take him long to see what was wrong. The horses were there, but the ground around them was freshly disturbed. Sand churned, marked with boot prints and the tracks of unfamiliar horses, and there, driven neatly into the earth, were Comanche arrows. Real arrows, with real beadwork on the shafts. Yet their placement was too precise, too staged, as if left to be found. Tohanu lifted one, turning it in his hand. The steel head gleamed, without a scratch or dusting of wear, never loosed in any fight. He looked at Eleanor, his voice low and steady. "This is not my people's work." She understood at once. A staged scene. A trap to pin blame on the Comanche, giving the army a reason to move in. And when that happened, it wouldn't only be his tribe. Anyone living in these lands would be caught in the pull of violence. Eleanor stepped back, a chill running along her spine. She knew Samuel Briggs didn't only want her. If this was his doing, it meant he was pulling the army into his grasp to seize the land itself. Tohanu kept searching, finding drag marks in the sand. Perhaps crates, perhaps weapons. The tracks led northwest, toward a dry river branch and a wagon trail that cut straight to Briggs's crossing. He returned to her, taking her reins, his eyes set. "We leave now." They mounted and circled along the hillside to avoid being seen. But at the ridge's crest, Tohanu reined in. Below, a group of 6 riders entered the valley, 3 in gray-blue army coats, 3 dressed as buffalo hunters with long rifles slung over their shoulders. Eleanor couldn't hear their words, but she saw one soldier stoop to pick up an arrow, hold it up, then nod. One of the hunters gestured east, as if pointing the way. Tohanu wasted no time. He turned from the ridge, guiding her into a slot canyon where rock and shade concealed their path. But before long, hoofbeats echoed behind them. Someone had caught their trail in the sand. He changed direction often, leading the horses over hard rock to break the tracks. Eleanor tried to stay calm, but her pulse kept its own frantic beat. Every time she glanced back, she saw nothing but sky, yet the feeling of pursuit clung like a shadow. By midday, they reached a deep rock cleft where water dripped into a small pool. While the horses rested, Tohanu knelt and washed the dust from the false arrow he'd kept. "We'll need this," he said. "Not to fight. With it, we prove the truth." Eleanor knew what he meant. If they could get the arrow to the right person, someone outside Briggs's reach, the frame-up could be exposed. But the road to such a person would be dangerous. By late afternoon, they were riding close to Red Rock cliffs, using the long shadows to hide their silhouettes. Then, rounding a tight bend, Eleanor saw someone waiting. A man, rifle in hand, wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. When he looked up, she knew him instantly. Those cold gray eyes, that tilted smile of mockery. Samuel Briggs. "I thought I'd have to hunt you longer," he said, voice sliding between his teeth. "But you've brought me quite the gift." Tohanu moved his horse between them, his hand easing toward the knife at his hip. Samuel raised his chin, signaling. From behind the rocks, 3 more gunmen emerged, blocking the way out. The air thickened with the smell of dust, sweat, and powder. Eleanor knew that if shooting started, their chances were slim. But Tohanu neither looked at her nor flinched. He only tipped his head, a small signal she didn't understand, until the hoofbeats came. They thundered in from the canyon to Samuel's left, 4 Comanche warriors, bows drawn and ready. In a heartbeat, the ground shifted. Samuel stepped back, surprise and anger flashing in his eyes. Tohanu didn't waste the moment. He drove his horse forward, pulling Eleanor with him through the gap the Comanche had opened. Shouts and pounding hooves filled the air, fading only when the cliffs swallowed them. When they were far enough, Eleanor glanced back. In the distance, Samuel stood rooted in the sand, hand tight on his gun, watching them like a man who'd just lost something he meant to own. Tohanu kept their pace until the sun dropped and the sky deepened to violet. Only then did he stop at a sheltered rock face, letting the horses rest and their own breaths slow. Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The proof they carried might not be enough to bring Briggs down, but they now understood exactly how far he was willing to go, and that meant every mile ahead would be even more dangerous. Night wind threaded through the canyon like a long whisper, breaking against the sheer rock walls and trembling faintly underfoot. Half a moon rode high, silver light sliding along red stone faces, just enough to catch movement on the narrow ledges. Eleanor and Tohanu had just led their horses into a sheltered hollow when Tohanu halted, eyes fixed on the canyon mouth. Out there, small points of light flickered. Torches. Not a small party. The glow revealed a mass of armed men, rifles slung, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. At their head was a tall, lean figure in a black coat, collar turned up, wide-brimmed hat pulled low enough to bury most of his face in shadow. Tohanu murmured, "Gideon Rourke." Eleanor knew the name. Mayor of Briggs's Crossing. A man who could spin gold from his tongue and still have his hands coated in the grit of backroom deals. If Briggs was the snake coiled around the land, Gideon was the piper leading it where he pleased. Gideon's men didn't march straight in. They fanned out, taking positions as though staging a scene. Among them, Eleanor spotted coils of rope, long burlap sacks, and a small wooden placard, the red letters smeared but still legible. Disturber of the peace. She understood at once. They meant to make Tohanu the scapegoat, to orchestrate a rescue for the sake of reputation, then quietly dispose of him. But Gideon's crew wasn't alone in the canyon tonight. Across the rock wall, hidden in shadow, a group of Comanche warriors watched in silence. No noise, no light. Only when Eleanor's eyes adjusted did their crouched figures take shape, bows resting across their knees, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Tohanu cast a quick glance their way, as though he'd known they were there all along. Then, from the northern path, more shapes emerged. Not soldiers, not cavalry, men in worn coats, hunting rifles on their shoulders, their steps cautious. Eleanor recognized a few faces from Briggs's Crossing, people who had turned away when she was humiliated in the market square, who had whispered behind her back whenever she passed. But tonight, they weren't empty-handed, and they weren't looking at her the way they used to. 3 factions, 1 canyon, space so tight that a single spark could ignite a storm of gunfire. Gideon stepped onto a low rise where moonlight cut across his face, catching the knife edge of his smile. His voice rolled smooth, rehearsed. "Mrs. Eleanor, we've come to take you somewhere safe." Eleanor said nothing. Tohanu moved half a step forward, blocking her from view. Gideon kept smiling, but his eyes shifted to Tohanu. "And you, tonight you pay for what your people have done." A sharp hiss split the air. An arrow struck the ground in front of Gideon's boot. The Comanche warriors had stepped from concealment to the cliff edge, bows drawn, their shadows looming. One of them spoke in English, voice like a whetted blade. "This man is not yours." Gideon looked up, expression unchanged, though his right hand tightened. He signaled, and his gunmen raised their rifles, aiming at both the Comanche and at Eleanor and Tohanu. The air thickened until every breath felt breakable. From the north, the townsmen moved fully into the open. An older man with silver hair and a frayed coat came forward, voice rough but firm. "We know about the horses. We know who staged that scene. And we won't let blood spill just to fatten the pockets of Briggs or you." Murmurs rippled through Gideon's ranks. A few faces faltered. Gideon cut them off with a flick of his hand. He drew his revolver, not pointing it yet, just turning it in his grip as if to remind everyone where power lay. Tohanu leaned slightly toward Eleanor, murmuring, "When they start arguing, we leave." But before they could move, a gunshot cracked, shattering the canyon air. No one knew who fired first. The answer came instantly. Return fire from every side. Torches toppled, darkness poured in, leaving only muzzle flashes and the high, panicked scream of horses. Eleanor was yanked down behind a boulder. Tohanu tossed her a small revolver, his gaze tracking every motion beyond their cover. On the cliffs above, Comanche warriors sent arrows slicing through the moonlight. Below, the townsmen crouched behind stone, firing back to cover each other's retreat. Gideon vanished into the chaos, though his voice still cut through, issuing clipped orders to his shooters. Eleanor spotted two of his men flanking toward their position. She signaled to Tohanu. He nodded once, then broke from cover, dropping one with a swift, crushing blow. The second flanker spun away when an arrow slammed into the ground behind him, loosed from a Comanche bow overhead. Eleanor looked up and met the warrior's eyes. He said nothing, only gave a single nod, a wordless recognition of shared cause. The fight burned fast, less than 10 minutes, but the ground was littered with shell casings, broken arrows, and dark stains. When the gunfire ebbed, Gideon withdrew with the men he had left, leaving behind the wounded and a silence heavy as stone. The townsmen approached. The silver-haired man spoke again. "We were wrong. If you and he need shelter, we'll help." Eleanor studied him for a long moment before she nodded once. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Up on the cliffs, the Comanche faded into the dark as if they'd never been there. Tohanu's hand closed lightly around hers, guiding her toward their horses. They said nothing, but both knew now every step would have to be chosen with care, because their enemies no longer came from only one direction. Gunsmoke still hung in the air, the sharp tang of sulfur mingling with the heat of stone and the salt of sweat. Shell casings littered the ground, and embers from toppled torches glowed faintly where they'd fallen. Gideon's men had pulled back to a safer distance, but the ring around them held. Eyes crossed from faction to faction, wary and ready to flare again. Eleanor stepped out from behind the boulder where she and Tohanu had taken cover. Her stride was slow but certain, and she met every stare head-on. For a moment, even the wind's hiss in the canyon seemed to ease, as if the cliffs themselves were waiting to see what she would do. She stopped in the open space between the three factions, chin lifted, voice clear and edged. "No one rescues me unless I ask for it." A ripple of murmurs passed through the lines. Gideon's gunmen frowned. Townsfolk traded glances, while the Comanche warriors above remained still as carved stone. Gideon's mouth bent in a thin, mocking smile, as if she'd told a joke in poor taste. "Mrs. Eleanor, I only want to take you back to be quiet." Her voice wasn't loud, but something in it made Gideon pause. She turned so the moon lit her face fully. "You know me as the humiliated wife at the market, as the weak woman who ran to the mountains. But the truth is, I carry Comanche blood, taken from my family when I was small. Everything you think you know about me is only half the story." A low tide of whispers swept the canyon. Above, one of the Comanche stepped closer to the ledge, eyes fixed on her. Eleanor went on. "Tohanu didn't abduct me. He saved me, from the same men pretending to protect me now." A voice called lies from Gideon's ranks, but before he could advance, Tohanu stepped forward, level with Eleanor. In moonlight, his English came as smoothly as river water, enough to still several faces in surprise. I know what happened at Briggs's Crossing, and I have proof. From inside his coat, he drew a leather-bound ledger and tossed it to the townsfolk's side. The silver-haired man caught it, flipped it open. Pages of numbers, signatures, and the mayor's seal stared back at him. "This," Tohanu said, each word like a hammer's strike, "is the record of horse sales proving the herd wasn't stolen. It was sold to traders in Santa Fe." And who took the money? Gideon Rourke and Briggs. They needed a story to hide it, so they staged a Comanche raid and chose me for the gallows. In Gideon's lines, loyalty shifted to unease. Murmurs rose. One man lowered his rifle. Gideon's gaze darkened at the crack in his hold. "You think he's more trustworthy than me?" Gideon's laugh was short, empty. The silver-haired man lifted his head from the ledger, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "If this is true, Briggs's Crossing has been lied to from the start, and we can't stand with the man who sold us out." From the cliffs came a sharp Comanche call. Bows lowered, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Eleanor stepped forward, eyes never leaving Gideon. "You wanted fame, power, land, but you forgot. Truth finds its way out, even in the deepest cut of a canyon." Gideon's fingers tightened on his revolver, but now 4 or 5 muzzles from his own side swung toward him. A grizzled veteran rasped, "I won't shoot this woman, and I won't shoot the man who saved her." The tide turned. Tohanu leaned toward Eleanor, a silent warning. Cornered predators strike hardest. Gideon proved him right. In one motion he raised his gun at Eleanor, but another shot cracked first. He staggered, weapon clattering to the dirt. Behind him, the silver-haired man lowered a smoking Winchester. "That's enough, Gideon," he said, voice steady and final. Gideon backed off, eyes scanning for escape, then turned south into the shadows, taking the loyal few with him. Hooves and footsteps faded into the canyon's dark. The air held only the wind now, and the heavy breathing of horses. The townsfolk approached. The silver-haired man returned the ledger to Eleanor. "You keep it. We'll need it when we get to Briggs's Crossing." She held it to her chest. Tohanu's hand found the small of her back, not to lead, but to say they'd walk on together. Above, the Comanche melted into the stone and shadow. Eleanor knew they would watch from now on, not out of distrust, but because a bond had just been reforged, fragile but weighty. As the moon slid westward, 3 factions became 2, and one unspoken vow remained. The truth would be carried back to where it had been stolen. 6 months had passed like summer clouds across a wide sky, quickly, but leaving their mark. Beside the very waterhole where Eleanor had first met Tohanu, a new trading post now stood, its adobe walls the color of baked earth, its pine beams set firm, its roof shingled with hand-hewn planks. The old cottonwood still shaded the water, its leaves trembling above the mirrored surface, but now beneath its branches rang children's laughter instead of the lone echo of hoofbeats. Children of many heritages, white, brown, mixed blood, chased each other across the yard, pausing to study hoofprints in the sand, while Tohanu knelt to show them which belonged to a wild horse and which to a pack animal. At the far corner, a few Comanche women traded strips of dried meat for linen from ranchers' wives. No one lowered their gaze anymore. Conversation passed as easily as cornbread, tallow, and twists of hand-rolled tobacco. Eleanor stepped from the trading post's door, a ledger of incoming goods in her hand. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt, but her face was bronzed from the sun, and her eyes carried a new steadiness. 6 months ago, she had stood in a canyon against gunfire. Today, she stood at the post's threshold, but the same fire burned in her chest. From the stables, Tohanu approached with a sack of oats slung over one shoulder. He set it down, wiped his brow, and looked at her with the kind of unspoken understanding that needed no translation. She handed him the day's sales record. Neither had to say we made it. The trading post's survival, in the middle of people who had once stood on 3 different sides, was answer enough. But frontier peace was never absolute. Word from Briggs's Crossing still drifted in with wagon trains. Gideon Rourke had vanished from town after that night in the canyon, but no one believed he had quit. The rumor was he was gathering the remnants of his men, not just for revenge, but to seize the cottonwoods' water. That afternoon, as the light slanted, Samuel, the silver-haired man who had once saved Eleanor in the canyon, rode in. He dismounted and handed her an envelope, its paper brittle from the sun, but the red seal still clear. A summons from the Briggs's Crossing town hall. Eleanor scanned it, then passed it to Tohanu. "They want us to testify, and not just about the horses," Tohanu said, his voice dropping. "They want to drag the post into it," Eleanor replied. Samuel's eyes swept the yard. Children playing, women trading. His voice lowered, meant only for the 2 of them. "Gideon's using the court as a snare. If you leave, the post will be undefended." A gust rattled the cottonwood leaves like a warning. Eleanor's hand tightened on the edge of the wooden table, her gaze moving over every face in the yard. She knew if Gideon took the upper hand again, what they'd built could collapse faster than a summer storm. Tohanu set a hand on her shoulder. "If we go to Briggs's Crossing, we won't go empty-handed." That night, firelight flickered under the cottonwood. The people of the post gathered, old townsfolk and Comanche warriors alike. Eleanor spread a map across a rough-hewn table, marking trails, watchpoints, and chokeholds where obstacles could be set if Gideon brought men. The real turning point wasn't in the gun count, but in the eyes of those who had once been enemies, now leaning over the same map, talking of how to hold a shared piece of land. Samuel recited the details of Gideon's crooked deals, while Tohanu laid out a way to present the evidence in court without revealing the post's defenses. Eleanor listened, speaking only when needed, and when she did, her words cut clean as a knife edge. By the time the fire burned low, the plan was set. Eleanor, Tohanu, and Samuel would ride to Briggs's Crossing with the proof. Behind them, townsfolk and Comanche together would guard the post. The cottonwood would be the signal. If white smoke rose from its branches, the enemy had come. Before they broke up, Eleanor looked around at them all. "We're not just guarding a trading post," she said. "We're keeping a promise. 6 months ago, that promise saved my life. Now, I'll keep it for all of us." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, as if in answer. Out here on the frontier, a promise could be stronger than timber walls or gun barrels, but they all knew the next trial was coming, and it would not come quietly. The autumn wind swept along the edge of the semi-desert, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint smoke from faraway cook-fires. The shadow of an old cottonwood stretched long across the waterhole, its ripples moving like the steady breath of the land. Eleanor stood there, fingertips grazing the cool surface, her braided hair threaded with colored ribbons that swayed with each passing gust. 6 months had worn their brightness a little, but not their meaning. Still the sign of harmony between people who once stood on opposite sides. The tread of Tohanu's boots sounded firm on the sandy ground. He stopped just behind her, not speaking right away, letting the silence draw out as if even the wind was waiting for the next chapter. Then he held out a new leather cord, soft, still smelling of tree resin, braided tight and sure. In the late light, it felt like a promise tied by hand, not written on paper. A different journey, he said, low but steady. South, past the red ridges and dry valleys. There's water there too, and people trying to live together without fear. Eleanor looked at the cord in her palm. This was no simple gift. From Tohanu, it was an invitation to join another beginning, not leaving cottonwood behind, but extending what they had built. Like a winter campfire's circle growing wider with more wood to keep it burning longer. She drew in a breath, her gaze sweeping the trading post behind them. A Comanche child laughing as a white boy handed him a piece of cornbread. Samuel checking the sacks of goods. Women swapping bundles of herbs for hand-forged knives. It all happened as if it had always been that way, without guarded looks or hesitation. If we go, Eleanor murmured, who will stay to keep this place? Tohanu tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting. We've planted the seed. They know how to tend it now. Samuel's agreed to watch over things, and some of the town families want to help. But Eleanor knew this journey south wasn't only about starting a new station. That land, by rumor, was divided. Ranch owners at odds with families newly arrived from Mexico. If they went to make peace, it would be Cottonwood's story all over again, but with sharper edges and higher stakes. That afternoon, they gathered around the wooden table beneath the cottonwood. A map was spread open, pencil marks tracing trails, water points, and stretches best avoided if they didn't want trouble. Samuel nodded as Tohanu outlined their plan to follow the dry riverbed, where the rocks gleamed pale as bone. Watch for Rourke, Samuel said without looking up. I haven't heard of him being caught. The words dropped like a pebble into still water. Eleanor understood. Men like Rourke didn't vanish. They waited. And the road south might be just the opening he needed, striking at the very thing she and Tohanu were working to build. Night fell. The trading post bathed in amber firelight. Eleanor stood apart, eyes fixed on the southern horizon where the dark swallowed the red hills. She remembered that day 6 months ago, when everything seemed ready to fall apart, and realized something. Strength wasn't about avoiding danger, but walking toward it with eyes open and a community at your back. By dawn, news arrived ahead of the sun. A caravan from the south reached Cottonwood, bringing goods and a story. The region stood on the brink of conflict, two sides close to drawing guns. The news poured oil onto her decision, turning the journey into something that could not be put off. She packed light, a dagger, her journal, some cotton cloth, and the leather cord from Tohanu. Before leaving, she stepped to the cottonwood, pressing her palm against its rough bark. No words spoken, only the quiet promise to return. When the sun broke over the ridges, they rode south. The wind caught the colored ribbons, carrying them into the morning light. Behind them, the trading post shrank, children's laughter fading into the steady rhythm of hooves. The horizon opened like a book yet unwritten, full of both possibility and risk. Eleanor knew hardship lay ahead, but also knew this. Every mile was a chance to prove that difference was not a fracture, but the pieces of a greater whole. Where wind and sand meet, there is no clean ending, only the road continuing. And for Eleanor and Tohanu, That horizon still held many stories waiting to be told. Some stories in the West don't end with applause or ringing bells. They end in a thick, heavy silence, where every glance, every breath of wind becomes a witness to a moment no one would ever want for themselves. That day, Eleanor was left behind in the very place that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new life. But she did not crumble. She did not weep. When the church doors closed behind the last person to leave, she stood there for a long while, as if listening to see whether her heart was still beating strong enough to carry her forward. Then Eleanor let the bouquet fall from her hands. A few petals came loose, spiraling slowly to the wooden floor, like the last illusions being swept away by the wind. Outside, the noon sun stretched across the main street, bright and unyielding. Eleanor walked out, straight past the averted eyes, past the half-swallowed whispers, and did not look back. Every step on the red-dusted earth was a vow to herself. No one would define her by the color of her skin, her origins, or by a single rejection. Perhaps the West was always meant for those pushed to the margins, but it was also where they learned to write their own story. And Eleanor understood. What had just happened was not an ending, but a pause. The road ahead of her was long, thirsty, and lined with turnings no one had yet dared to take. Somewhere out there, someone would see her without the haze of prejudice. Somewhere, there would be a hand extended, not to stop her, but to walk beside her. But to find that moment, she would have to keep going, starting now. If you've ever stood at a crossroads like that, between giving up or pressing on, what would you choose? Would you turn back, or let the dust swallow the past and seek a new sunrise? Share your thoughts in the comments. Eleanor's story is just one piece among countless others in Wild West love stories, where love, pain, and resilience weave together in every step across the sand. If you want to keep hearing untold tales, memories still tinged with gunpowder and wildflower scent, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because the next story might be the one you need most, exactly when you need it.